welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Just a quick note before we get started that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, you can stay up to date with new episodes by hitting the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts if you haven't done so already. You can also find a full archive of previous episodes at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. The storming of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. by pro-Trump insurrectionists earlier this month was both shocking and utterly unsurprising. After all, for anyone paying attention to the rioters' social media posts in the days and weeks leading up to the event, they made their intentions clear. A subset of the participants appeared to have technical training and had laid meticulous plans well in advance of January 6th. Far-right militia groups could be heard on the walkie-talkie app Zello, egging on the rioters as they pushed further into the Capitol building. It was, they said, and I quote, "everything we effing trained for." The attack on the Capitol, then, was a culmination, not just of the insurrectionists' efforts to train and arm themselves for a violent revolt, but also of years of recruitment and radicalization by violent extremist groups in the United States, all too often egged on by Donald Trump and his supporters. At the same time, as my guest for today points out, January 6th was not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a dangerous new era in which attacks by violent extremist groups could become ever more commonplace. To dig into this issue, I'm joined now by a scholar who's done some really important work in the field of domestic and transnational terrorism. Colin Clarke is Director of Policy and Research at the Soufan Group. Welcome back to Trendlines.
Thanks for having me.
In the wake of the attempted insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, the question I've heard the most is, how could this have happened? How could there be such a spectacular breach of security, despite the many clear signs that the Trump supporters gathering in D.C. that day were threatening violence? What's your read on the main reasons for that security failure?
Well, I think there's a number of factors at play, to be honest. The first is the president himself. We're in a fairly unique situation where you've got the commander-in-chief actually, functioning as the person inciting the violence. So I think, there's a certain fear that Trump instilled in his underlings throughout the government. We've seen that, really across the board in defense, security, take your pick, in really every sector. Any kind of attempt to push back against the president or any, even the slightest hint of insubordination was met with a firing or a public browbeating. So I think that was probably number one. Number two, I think, there's clearly a double standard here in the way that law enforcement treats white protesters or demonstrators. And I don't even think that's what we would call these people. They're insurrectionists to me. And African-American or Muslim or other people of color. You saw this summer when there was Black Lives Matter protests around the Capitol, we rolled out stormtroopers to protect it and intimidate them. So why wasn't that in place? Here you had Trump supporters telling you exactly what they intended to do. We're going to storm the Capitol, right? And so there was missed signals, and there was just really a failure to take the threat seriously. And, for someone that studied jihadis, for 20 years, in that field, we always say, take them at their word, right? If they say they're going to attack you, they're going to attack you. So I don't understand why, again, a double standard here, but a clear failure.
A lot of people in the country are now just starting to learn the names of organizations like the Boogaloo Boys, the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters. These violent extremist groups, often white supremacist, have been getting a lot of attention, largely as a result of heightened activity, it seems, during the Trump presidency. But in reality, these groups have been around for a while and will continue to be around after Trump leaves office. For me, that prompts the question of, how should we understand the relationship between the Trump presidency and the far-right extremist movement in the U.S.? Is there a causal relationship there, given the president's rhetoric and his actions, or is it something less sinister?
Well, you're exactly right. This is a movement that's been around. There's some great scholarship on the topic, whether it's Kathleen Belew's book, Bring the War Home, where she documents the evolution of this movement and its various kind of outgrowths, after major wars in this country, most prominently the Vietnam War, but also Bruce Hoffman's book, his legendary book, Inside Terrorism, now in its third edition, where Bruce documents the evolution of the far right, domestic extremist threat in the United States. Some of the groups you mentioned now, like the Boogaloo Boys, are just modern day incarnations of an old threat. But I think, for me, the far right extremist movement, if you want to call it that, which is a fairly broad umbrella, um, it's more diverse than at any time in the past because not only do you have your mainstays, which are kind of anti-government militias, but you also now have a collection of white supremacists, of neo Nazis, of really just kind of anti-government authority groups, organizations, and individuals that have come to the forefront. Some motivated by the Second Amendment, others motivated by internet culture. If you look at the Boogaloo Boys, and really kind of all unified more by what they're against than what they're for.
So, an ongoing threat, an ongoing feeling of grievance against government authority that has been supercharged in a way under the Trump presidency. Can we say that?
Yeah, I'd say supercharged is accurate. I mean, I wrote a piece in the LA Times in late November where I pretty much said Trump's violent rhetoric is laying the groundwork for years of unrest. And people responded to me and said, "You're an alarmist. Oh, look, the sky's falling. This is hyperbole. You're overreacting." And I take no great pleasure in being right. To people in my field, what happened on the 6th was rather obvious. Where I think people get it wrong is they say this was the logical outgrowth of 4 years of Trump. I don't look at what happened on the 6th as the end of anything. I look at it as a beginning. In fact, I think this could very well be the beginning of a golden age of domestic extremism in this country. The other part I'll mention briefly is, when we talk about what happened there, and I think you even mentioned this earlier, the failed insurrection, right? We look at it as like, oh man, thank God it failed. The extremists don't look at this as a failure. They look at this as an overwhelming and resounding success because they're now able to use images from this day as proof of concept. I mean, I was monitoring some channels online. Within 2 hours of the insurrection, they were already circulating propaganda and memes, etc. So this is really a rallying cry for the far right.
As you and I are speaking, it's the eve of inauguration, January 19th, starting tomorrow at noon. We will no longer have a commander in chief who name checks the Proud Boys. But as you say, that doesn't mean the threat is over. What do we need to be preparing for once Trump is out of office?
Yeah, I think we need to be preparing for a situation where we could be facing regular attacks in this country, almost, and I hate to make this comparison, I don't mean to be trite, but almost in the same way that we deal with school shootings and mass shootings. It's kind of become a regular feature of American society in a really morose way. So, I have friends that live overseas in Europe, and they'll text me and say, "Oh my God, I can't believe what happened today. You guys doing okay?" And I'm like, "Well, what happened? I missed it." "Oh, 6 people were shot at a factory in Tennessee." And I'm like, "Oh, oh no, no, that's not on the news." Like, it's just, we know what the steady drumbeat is, right? Politicians come forward, they offer, a half-hearted response. Now's not the time to talk about guns, thoughts and prayers, rinse and repeat. And I don't think that will be the response with domestic terrorism because terrorism has a way of really seizing the country's attention. The media really focuses on it, and that's by design, right? I mean, a huge component of terrorism is the psychological aspect. It's the communicative aspect of what these people want to convey, their range of grievances. So, but I think we need to be prepared for. And this term is overused and a bit hackneyed, but the new normal. I think we are entering a potential phase now where these regular, domestic terrorism attacks could be just that, like, almost banal in a sense.
There was an article that you co-wrote with Bruce Hoffman, whom you mentioned earlier in July for the Cipher Brief, that I thought was fascinating, and I wanted to ask you about. It's called "The Growing Irrelevance of Organizational Structure for U.S. Domestic Terrorism." And you and Bruce drew the comparison, or the contrast, rather, I should say, between the sort of loosely organized domestic extremists that we're seeing now and hierarchical organizations like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. What is the difference there in terms of the way people are radicalized into white supremacist groups and other extremists mean for the response to tackle this threat?
Well, I think, the way that they're radicalized into these groups might not be so different. In fact, here, it's just the fact that, one, you had the president who started off with, I'd say a dog whistle after Charlottesville. That grew into a megaphone by the end of his time in office. So you had, the president directly making an appeal to individuals that would and did engage in acts of political violence. There's a sense of legitimacy that's been conferred upon them. But what Bruce and I tried to highlight was the fact that, we've been so narrowly focused on Salafi jihadists for the last 20 years. And rightfully so. They represent a major threat, right? Groups like Al Qaeda, ISIS, and their respective affiliates and franchise groups. But instead of organizations and groups, what we're now dealing with is individuals or lone actors, if you will, and movements. And so it's much more difficult to grasp the threat. We've constructed this worldwide counterterrorism architecture to deal with a threat that was transnational in nature. And while there are transnational aspects of white supremacy and neo-Nazi ideology, we're looking at a kind of potpourri of groups that exist on U.S. soil that are domestic in nature and that enjoy, First Amendment, Second Amendment rights in a way that ISIS members overseas don't.
And as you mentioned earlier, there's sort of a range of ideologies that these groups mobilize around. It can be anything from gun rights to just blanket anti-authority to genuine white supremacy or neo-Nazi views.
Exactly, and they're also not mutually exclusive. So, one of the terms we mention in there is this term fringe fluidity, which my colleague David Gartenstein Ross has talked about. It's that ability to kind of feel comfortable holding multiple views, some of which might be contradictory. And we've seen this in multiple instances. The Northern Virginia transit cop, Nick Young, who espoused neo-Nazi views and also admiration for the Islamic State. This guy, Ethan Melzer, who was in the Army and was flirting with this group Order of the Nine Angles. So there's all these kind of new permutations. Devin Arthurs, who was a white supremacist turned radical Islamist and then murdered his roommates for mocking his newfound zeal for Islam. So I think that's one of our failures as analysts, is a failure of imagination and a failure to recognize that humans are complex beings. And while we might not think their beliefs make sense, they are what they are, and we have to try to figure out a way to come to terms with dealing with them. We talk a lot about countering violent extremism, but I still don't think we understand violent extremism.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, it's become somewhat of a kind of catchphrase and dare I say a cottage industry, because there's a lot of money thrown at the problem. And when we said CVE for the last 10 years, it was really a stand-in for countering jihadi ideology. There was a failure to kind of look beyond that. And now that it's, the threat is emanating from white people here, people are saying like, oh, well, that's not going to work, or, well, what are we going to do? And kind of throwing up their hands. And I'll admit, as a researcher, I'm a bit flummoxed as to how to approach the magnitude of the threat and the sheer scale of it, because, QAnon, we haven't mentioned QAnon yet, that conspiracy theory. I don't know how you deal with people that truly believe that Hillary Clinton is eating babies, right? I mean, and apparently there's a lot of people that believe that. So how do you even meet them on a level playing field? This is a far cry from even some of the old ethno-nationalist terrorist groups that we're used to dealing with. They're fighting over land, right? There's a negotiation to be had. How do you negotiate with people whose grievances don't actually exist in real life?
It seems from what you're describing that there's a threat out there that the community that you're a part of, the people who study violent extremism and counterterrorism, are just now starting to wrap their arms around and get their minds around how to tackle. Do you feel like the Biden administration has a sense of how to approach this and how to tackle this issue?
I don't know that they have a sense of how to tackle it, but I do have a sense that they realize it's an important issue and plan to tackle it. I think, there'll be conversations with, folks in my field of what are best practices and lessons learned. Are there, lessons that we can glean from the last 20 years in the fight against Al Qaeda that might be applicable? Now, they're all not going to be, right? But some might be, and some of the mechanisms might be. So I think the sense of urgency is quite high for the Biden administration, and now the hard work, comes with, well, how exactly do you deal with it, right? And we've got no shortage of other challenges, including a COVID-19 pandemic, right? There's a lot of issues on the incoming administration's plate. I think this one will be toward the top of the list, though.
You mentioned earlier the transnational aspects of the domestic violent extremist or white supremacy extremist threat. And that brought to my mind the coalition that the Obama administration put together at the height of the ISIS threat in 2014, comprising dozens of countries to really tackle all different aspects of this threat. Could you talk a little bit about the transnational aspects of the domestic extremist threat that we're seeing, and what kind of room there might be for the Biden administration to partner with other countries in terms of really tamping down those linkages?
Yeah, sure. We wrote a paper, we published a paper at the Soufan Center in September 2019, where we looked at the transnational nature of the violent white supremacy extremist threat. And it was widely regarded, and I think still holds true in many respects. We've since written several white papers looking at other elements of this threat, including one on the Russian imperial movement, RIM, which has been designated by the State Department. First time the state has ever designated a white supremacist group, as well as Atomwaffen and some of these other iterations. So I think, there's a lot to talk about in terms of cooperation. I think certainly if you look at countries like Germany, which has really struggled with the threat, the United Kingdom, Scandinavian countries, right? There's a lot of potential for cooperation there. It's going to be tough with the Russians. We know that groups like the Azov Battalion fighting in Ukraine and other kind of white nationalist groups are offered kind of state sponsorship in that part of the world. So that will be a bit more of a challenge, but it's still worth pursuing.
We've all read the reports and seen the videos of Capitol police officers who seemed to sympathize with the rioters on January 6th, removing barricades for them, even in one case taking selfies with them. At the same time, there were a lot of people among the insurrectionists with backgrounds in military or law enforcement. How do those apparent sympathies for these causes among military or law enforcement professionals make this a problem that's more difficult to tackle?
Oh, it's a huge problem. When you look at groups like the Oath Keepers, when you look, at individuals that have combat experience, certainly if they're still in the armed forces, that's a major vulnerability. But even for those that have since left the military, they've got training in operation security, in tradecraft, and how to handle a weapon. So you're talking about when you have those kinds of people in a group in a violent mob like we saw on January 6th, they act as kind of a force multiplier in making that mob actually more lethal. There was a video that I watched where there was a broken window and you had a gentleman, maybe that's not the right term for him, ushering people through the window in pairs of two, right? Next two in, next two in, next two in. It was something you'd see, if you were to watch a video of, troops hitting an objective in Iraq or Afghanistan. I mean, clearly this person had some type of training. We saw two-way walkie-talkies, people with earpieces in, others that had neon orange tape on their shirt, probably to suggest to others who's a friendly and who's not, since the Proud Boys didn't wear their matching uniforms that they like to wear all the time. So we're talking about a decentralized movement, but within that movement, you've got highly trained individuals that know what they're doing. And that's dangerous because, like I talked about opening the show, they're given the benefit of the doubt. They look like the majority of people in this country look like. And clearly there's sympathies from folks in law enforcement and these people. If you go back to the Michigan issue with the plot to kidnap Governor Whitmer, you had a local sheriff that was actually standing on the state capitol with some of the people implicated in that plot. It's you can't make this stuff up.
Even on January 6th, the placement of pipe bombs at the DNC and RNC headquarters nearby seemed to suggest to a lot of observers that that was a coordinated effort to distract attention away from the Capitol, to lessen the security at the Capitol.
Yeah, and that's a major concern. The pipe bombs, that perpetrator still hasn't been found. Another thing that I'm finally seeing the media talking about is as the Capitol itself in Washington is hardened, that acts as a deterrent, and it may very well drive people to attack state capitals, right, in places like Harrisburg, Lansing, Richmond, Virginia. So we have to be concerned about that as well, because state capitals are going to be under far less scrutiny than Washington, where the inauguration is taking place. And I was joking with a friend of mine who said it's the equivalent of when the emir tells foreign fighters don't travel to the caliphate stay home and attack in your local wilayat or affiliate branch, right? I mean, it's actually not too different.
In terms of some of the measures that are being taken to address this threat, we've seen a lot of focus on deplatforming, on removing some of the online infrastructure that these groups use to organize. We finally saw the walkie-talkie app Zello, which a lot of the rioters were using to coordinate their activities, take action and delete some accounts. But then there's also a concern that deplatforming might drive some of these extremists underground, as our columnist Candice Rondeau wrote last week. I'm curious how you see this tactic playing into the effort to combat these groups.
Well, it's a double edged sword. And I think it's a good thing to remove these voices from mainstream platforms because they do have a radicalizing effect when this propaganda is able to reach large numbers of Americans. Even if it's only actually changing the minds of a small percentage. In aggregate, we're a country of 330 million, right? And we've always said terrorism is a numbers game. Um, in the near term, you're correct. You're pushing people to fringe platforms, to marginalized platforms where we lose the OSINT impact, the open source intelligence effect, where we can watch them talking about things openly and in public. I think in the overall, if we were to kind of take a step back and do a cost benefit analysis, it's still a net positive to boot them off and deplatform them from these mainstream sites because at the end of the day, there is a radicalizing effect, and there's some studies by colleagues of mine like J.M. Berger, Amar Amarasingam, that have looked at the impact on ISIS and have concluded that kind of the same thing in the long run, it's generally good to have them off these platforms and to push them to the shadows.
What are some other tactics that have maybe come to the fore recently that are being used against these groups in terms of really tackling the root causes that drive people to extremist views?
Well, I think root causes is a delicate situation because there's still not a lot of agreement within terrorism studies and among scholars over what root causes are. You can see it with the Capitol insurrection, right? I've heard people saying, "Oh man, look, this is a result of economic anxiety." But you also have a realtor taking her private jet there. I think and sure, that's one single data point. It's just so hard. We look for a typology, we look for a silver bullet to build this profile of what causes people to go into this life. And it's just not that easy. If you look at some of the literature on the psychology of terrorism, John Horgan's a preeminent scholar there. We're making kind of progress, but it's slow and it's kind of one step forward, two steps back. That's the essence of what makes this such a difficult field.
Since you mentioned psychology, do you sense that there's perhaps a need to diversify and bring in more kinds of different academic disciplines to really study this from, like you said, an economic perspective, from an anthropological perspective? Is that something that's going on?
Yeah, I mean that's something that's the field's been trending in that direction from I'd say probably the last 10, maybe 15 years. Uh, I was trained at the RAND Corporation, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank, and interdisciplinary research is really a strong suit of RAND. So I was a political scientist there, but my teams almost always included sociologists, psychologists, economists, statisticians, etc. This is the type of research that I was trained in, and I think it's really the only way to kind of get at this issue in a comprehensive way.
One thing we haven't talked about yet is the complicity of the Republican Party itself, not only in encouraging the riot on January 6th itself, but also engaging in the kind of rhetoric, in a lot of cases promoting violent means and sort of this don't back down extremism that has really fostered this movement. Even after Trump leaves, are you concerned that the Republican Party could continue to act as a kind of galvanizing force like that?
Yeah, because there's no disincentives, right? There's no accountability that would actually lead them to change their behavior. We talk a lot about accountability in this country, but as a culture, I think we've moved away from it. When we talk about accountability now, it's usually low level folks, right? So the people that storm the Capitol, we'll make a big show about arresting them. But yeah, exactly right. What about the politicians that egged them on? What about the media companies that for years spread lies and disinformation on their channels and on their platforms. My colleague Ali Soufan has called them rage profiteers, and I think he's exactly right. So, will there be accountability there? And if not, what's the disincentive to continue this type of behavior moving forward?
It makes it a little bit difficult, I suppose, with the whole First Amendment thing and the lack of a legal framework to prosecute that kind of, or to kind of put a label on that kind of behavior and rein it in.
Yeah, in some ways, but in others, we actually have laws on the books against insurrection. So there's a lot of talk now about, do we need a domestic terrorism statute? I think for starters, we just need to begin enforcing the laws that we already have. That's an issue of political will. We don't have the political will to do that. And there's other complications with enacting a domestic terrorism statute. One of the reasons we don't have one now is for the fear that a president or another politician could use it to label his political adversaries as enemies. President Trump's mentioned several times designating Antifa. What's to lead us to believe that he wouldn't designate Black Lives Matter, right? If he had a domestic terrorism statute, so we have to be really careful there. I think certainly making domestic terrorism, a federal offense, a crime, is something that could happen. And I suspect that the Biden administration is giving a lot of thought to various kind of possibilities right now.
Are there any other flashpoints or notable trends that you're keeping an eye on going forward related to this issue?
Yeah, there are. One in particular, which is, these conversations that are taking place on Telegram and other social media channels amongst kind of your more hardcore extremist types, your white supremacists, neo-Nazis, who are kind of openly talking about, how do we co-opt some of, they use a derogatory name for Trump supporters, even though they themselves in some respects are Trump supporters. But I'll call them MAGA zealots, for lack of a better term, right? The most kind of hardcore. How do they co-opt them into their movements, right? Because these people have now fled mainstream platforms like Twitter. If you look at QAnon, there's already a lot of overlap with anti-Semitic beliefs in that conspiracy. And so I think they look at this as a major recruiting opportunity to bring new blood into their movement. And I think what we've already seen in Charlottesville was emblematic of this. There's an old trope or stereotype that, white supremacists are white, uneducated, rural, and to the extent that that's ever been true, it certainly no longer is. We've seen the far right uh, evolve domestically, along geographic lines, socioeconomic lines, and demographic lines. So this isn't your father's white supremacist group. Some of these people are, well-to-do. Some are highly technically capable. And I think, especially during the last year with the COVID-19 pandemic, we don't know until we're a couple of years out, because there's always a lag effect with this type of stuff, especially in getting access to data and analyzing it. But I think we're going to look back at 2020 as a huge boon to far right extremism, and really kind of an infusion of new lifeblood into these various movements and organizations. And I think that's another thing that's going to propel this movement forward throughout this decade.
We had Bulama Bukarti on, who's a expert on Boko Haram and other extremist groups in sub-Saharan Africa, on the show a couple weeks ago, and there was a metaphor he used to describe the effort there of scooping water out of a bathtub as the faucet is on full blast. So no matter how much water you scoop out of the bathtub, if you don't stop the faucet from running in and pouring water into the bathtub, you're never going to actually start to solve the problem.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we're dealing with here. I mean, just to bring up one more example, earlier today, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo sent out a tweet where he called out what he sees as things that are un-American. He says censorship, wokeness, political correctness, but in his actual tweet, he also references multiculturalism, and he says that's not who America is. That's an actual white supremacist talking point. I don't know if the secretary knew that or not, if he was aware of that.
It's not even coded anymore. It's not even a whistle. Yeah.
I assume that as the former director of the CIA, he's aware of what, domestic extremist groups use as talking points, and maybe he just erred. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. But if you were more cynical, you might think that that was a kind of a direct call out to the same people that stormed the Capitol on January 6th, and that maybe, just maybe, again, if you're really cynical, that was, his way of positioning himself for 2024 to pick up the base that has been supporting President Trump these last 4 years.
Steve Metz, who you and I both know, former WPR columnist, made that exact point. I saw in a reply to Pompeo to that tweet.
Yeah, and Steve's somebody I read very closely.
Colin, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Colin Clarke is Director of Policy and Research at the Soufan Group. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and hosted by Peter Dury. You can follow the team on Twitter if you'd like. WPR's handle is @WPReview. I'm @Elliot Waldman. That's with 2 L's, 1 T. And Peter is @PeterDoerrie. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.